Vendor assessments exist because external partners can become part of your attack surface the moment they touch your data, your systems, or your business-critical workflows. When a service is outsourced or a platform is integrated, the risk does not disappear, and it changes shape because you now depend on another organization's governance, engineering discipline, and operational reliability. A thoughtful assessment is not an exercise in mistrust, and it is a way to evaluate whether the partner manages risk in a manner that is compatible with your obligations and your tolerance for failure. The outcome should be clear enough that you can explain why the relationship is acceptable, what conditions must be met, and what you will monitor going forward. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CISS books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Assessments are usually triggered by specific events, because that is when risk is most likely to shift and when leverage is highest. New onboarding is the obvious trigger because this is when you still have the option to choose another provider or to demand changes before integration. Renewals matter because contracts can be updated, pricing and scope can change, and previously accepted weaknesses may no longer be acceptable as your environment evolves. Expansions, such as adding new products, new regions, or new data types, can change exposure dramatically and should be treated as a reassessment rather than a minor amendment. Critical changes, like a vendor acquisition, a major architecture redesign, a move to a different hosting model, or a new sub-processor, can invalidate prior assumptions and should trigger a focused review. Risk tiering is how you avoid treating every vendor as equally important, and it generally uses data sensitivity, connectivity, privilege, and service criticality to establish a risk category. Data sensitivity addresses what information the vendor processes, stores, or can access, and whether that includes regulated personal data, financial records, intellectual property, or authentication secrets. Connectivity describes how the vendor connects to your environment, whether through a simple file exchange, a persistent application programming interface integration, or deep network and identity integration. Privilege captures whether the vendor can administer systems, manage configurations, or access production environments in ways that could cause significant harm if misused. Service criticality addresses how operationally dependent you are, meaning whether an outage would be inconvenient or whether it would halt core business functions. Tiering should drive how deep the assessment goes, because a high-tier vendor deserves more rigorous assurance than a low-tier supplier. Questionnaires are a common starting point because they collect control information across governance, operations, and technical safeguards in a consistent format. Governance topics include security leadership structure, risk management practices, policy frameworks, training, and incident response governance.
Operational topics include change management discipline, vulnerability management, patching timelines, monitoring, backup practices, and how access is approved and reviewed.
Technical safeguard topics include encryption practices, identity and access management, network segmentation, secure development lifecycle practices, and logging and detection capability. The value of questionnaires is that they create a comparable data set and highlight where the vendor's story is unclear or incomplete.
The limitation is that questionnaires capture claims, not proof, so they should be treated as a map for where to ask for evidence rather than as assurance by themselves.
Independent reports, such as service organization control examinations, provide standardized assurance evidence and can reduce the need to reinvent assessment from scratch. These reports are valuable because they are produced under recognized examination standards, and they typically describe the control environment, the scope of the system, and the results of testing performed by an independent auditor. They can also provide insight into control objectives, testing procedures, and exceptions that were identified during the examination period. However, the usefulness depends on fit, meaning the scope and system described must align with the service you actually use and the way you use it. A report can be clean and still irrelevant if your integration relies on components outside the report's boundary, or if your use case introduces risks not covered by the reported controls. Independent reports are strong evidence, but they are not automatic approval. On-site or remote reviews add depth because they validate implementation and operational practices beyond what a document can show. A review might examine how access is provisioned for administrators, how production changes are authorized, how monitoring alerts are triaged, and how incident response is executed under pressure. It can also validate separation of duties, evidence retention, and whether controls are consistent across regions or environments rather than being strong in one area and weak in another. Remote reviews often rely on demonstrations and artifact review, while on-site reviews can provide additional confidence through direct observation of processes and facilities where relevant. The point is not to perform a hostile inspection, and it is to confirm that the stated controls exist and operate reliably. For high-tier vendors, this kind of validation can be the difference between trusting a narrative and trusting a system. Contract review is where risk management becomes enforceable because it verifies security requirements, audit rights, and notification timelines in language that has legal weight. Security requirements might include minimum control standards, incident response expectations, encryption requirements, background checks for privileged staff, and obligations for vulnerability remediation and patching. Audit rights define whether you can obtain evidence, request reports, or perform assessments, and they determine how you respond when risk changes or a control fails. Notification timelines matter because incident communication that arrives late can turn a manageable event into a major business crisis, especially when regulatory reporting clocks are running. Contract review should also address liability, subcontracting constraints, and termination obligations, because those shape the practical outcomes of a failure. A vendor can be technically strong, but if the contract does not support accountability, the relationship remains risky. Understanding data flow is essential because you cannot assess risk without knowing what data is shared and where it resides. This includes what data types are transmitted, what is stored, what is processed transiently, and what is cached or logged in ways that may persist longer than expected. It also includes geographic residency, replication, backup handling, and the vendor's own internal data classification, because these factors shape legal and operational exposure. Many vendor issues occur because teams assume data is only passing through when it is actually being stored, or they assume it is stored only in one region when it is replicated globally. When data flow is mapped clearly, you can evaluate whether the vendor's controls match the sensitivity and regulatory obligations of the data involved. Data flow clarity also supports incident response because you know where to look and what must be contained or notified. Access paths often represent the most immediate technical risk, and they include application programming interfaces, remote administration mechanisms, and integrated identity federation. Application programming interfaces can expose data and functionality, and their security depends on authentication, authorization, rate limiting, and careful scoping of tokens and permissions. Remote administration can include vendor support access or managed service access into your environment, and this raises questions about privileged access management, session logging, approval workflows, and emergency access procedures.
Identity federation integrates your authentication model with the vendor, which can simplify user management but also creates coupling, because token misuse or federation misconfiguration can lead to broad access. A sound assessment identifies each access path, its privileges, its monitoring, and the failure modes that could lead to unauthorized activity. If access paths are not understood, the relationship can be high risk, even if the vendor appears mature.
Subprocessor use expands risk because it introduces additional parties into the chain, and it requires visibility and contractual controls to prevent risk from spreading invisibly. When a vendor relies on subprocessors for hosting, support, analytics, or specialized processing, your data and your security assumptions now extend into those third parties. You need to know who the subprocessors are, what they do, where they operate, and what control obligations they must meet, because a weak subprocessor can undermine a strong primary vendor. Contracts should require notification of subprocessor changes, allow you to object where appropriate, and bind subprocessors to equivalent security and confidentiality standards. Visibility also matters for incident response, because subprocessors may be involved in the containment and reporting timeline. Without subprocessor governance, vendor risk becomes supply chain risk by default. When gaps are found, remediation plans are what turn assessment outcomes into safer relationships, and those plans should include owners, timelines, and validation expectations. Owners should be clear on both sides, meaning you know who at the vendor is accountable for delivering the fix and who in your organization is accountable for tracking and verifying it. Timelines should reflect severity and practical effort, and they should include interim risk treatment when fixes will take time, such as restricted access scope, increased monitoring, or compensating controls. Validation expectations define what evidence will demonstrate closure, such as configuration screenshots, updated policies, test results, or independent attestation. A remediation plan without validation is a promise, not a control improvement. The goal is to reach a state where the risk posture is acceptable and demonstrable. Ongoing monitoring matters because vendor risk is not a one-time decision, and control posture can shift as companies change, products evolve, and new threats appear. Monitoring can include tracking changes in scope, new regions, new features, changes in subprocessors, and changes in connectivity or privileges. It should also include awareness of incidents, outages, and security advisories that may affect your exposure, along with periodic review of assurance artifacts and exceptions. For high-tier vendors, ongoing monitoring often includes regular check-ins, scheduled reassessments, and integration of vendor signals into your broader risk management program. The reason is simple. A vendor that was acceptable last year can become unacceptable this year if its environment changes or if your use of the service expands. Continuous awareness prevents stale approvals. Termination planning is often ignored until it is urgent, but it should be part of the assessment because exits are where risk can spike. Planning should cover data return, data deletion, and access removal steps, including how you verify that deletion occurred and how long backups may retain data after termination. It should also cover revocation of application programming interface keys, federation trust relationships, administrative access pathways, and any persistent connectivity that could remain if not explicitly dismantled. A good plan clarifies what artifacts you need to preserve for compliance, what evidence must be retained, and how you ensure continuity if the vendor relationship ends suddenly due to breach or business failure. Termination planning is not pessimism, and it is resilience, because it ensures you can disengage without leaving residual exposure behind. Vendor assessment supports trust by validating controls and accountability, and the best assessments produce a relationship that is both operationally productive and security aware. Tiering ensures effort matches risk. Questionnaires and reports establish a baseline of control information, and deeper reviews confirm that controls operate in practice. Contracts translate expectations into enforceable obligations, while data flow and access path mapping clarify where exposure truly lives. Subprocessor governance prevents hidden expansion of risk, remediation plans drive improvements, ongoing monitoring keeps the picture current, and termination planning ensures you can exit safely. When all of these elements work together, trust is not assumed, and it is earned through evidence, transparency, and sustained control performance. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.